Why I am not Marcel Duchamp. A list of variables. 1. He was warm. It is possible to study the laws of thermodynamics. If one wishes to make ice, iced cream, or popsicles, it is necessary to define a temperature beneath which the stability of water as a liquid becomes a stability in which water can be defined as a solid. In wintertime, when it is cold, one adjusts the thermostat, or if a thermostat is unavailable, one can split wood, create kindling, and light a fire. Outside, when it is hot, I sweat. Inside, when it is cold, I go outside. If one wishes to make it rain, it is necessary to alter atmospheric pressure between layers in which various accumulations of moisture and humidity are locked, trapped, or isolated. In order to accomplish this, it is useful to know something about the laws of thermodynamics. In summertime, when one is in exertion, resulting from exercise or activity of some other kind, under the brutal heat of the sun, the act of sweating becomes useful and purposeful, efficacious in allaying the discomfort and health risks which arise from temperatures in excess of what can be defined as mild. 2. He was very careful with his language. Sometimes the words are, and sometimes the language isn't. Being careful is as careful does. Idiomatically speaking, a language belongs to the tongue. Mothers and fathers have these. To be careful is not to spill the milk. If the milk is spilled, one may be reprimanded. This is not to say that the spilling of milk is a. This is not to say the spilling of milk is. This is not to say is a. This is not to say. This is not to say. This is not to say the spilling of milk is a crime. This is not to say the spilling of milk is a crime, but an offense that one should be careful to avoid. In the same way that one should be careful to avoid offenses made in language, whether such offenses are made in the construction, articulation, deployment, or something about being careful with language, something other than the grammar, something other than the voice, something other than those kinds of care that belong to pattern, something other than 3. He was magical. In this way, I am, if not identical to Marcel Duchamp, certainly very much like him. 4. He was not judgmental. I judge this, I judge that. I judge for, I judge with. I judge next to, I judge because of. I am not a judge, but I judge judges. I am not judgmentalistically minded, but I judge judgment. I have read the critique of judgment. I judge it. I admit I judge it. I don't judge it entirely unfairly, but I don't judge it discreetly, frugally, carefully. I judge it instrumentally. I perform all types of instrumental judgment. I perform all types of socially, politically motivated judgment. I perform all types of judgment. I judge judgment itself. I judge the phonemes in judgment. I judge the etymology of judgment, the judge in judgment, and the mental in judgmental. I judge the construction of sentences either made in E prime or made against the interdictions of not making sentences in E prime. I judge the was. I judge the pronoun he. Why is the pronoun he not the pronoun she, they, or I? Or perhaps, being less careful with language, him was not judgmental. Me was not judgmental. If me and him was not judgmental, if he was me, and if was not is judgmental, then perhaps I would have been somewhat more like Marcel Duchamp. But I judge. I judge the not. I judge the T and the O and not. I judge the S and the A and the W in was. And I judge and wonder why it was not he saw not judgment rather than he was not judgmental. Or perhaps him saw not judgmental rather than he was not judgmental. In these ways, my judgment is significantly not like that of Marcel Duchamp. 5. He was very frugal. Frugal is as frugal does. Frugal is a kind of value, an economic value, a kind of conceptual understanding of the limitations of space and of time, as if it were very easy to run out of these things, and that one should try to fit everything in a very short amount of space and a short amount of time, because people simply, don't have the time, energy, or interest to pay attention to something that goes on for too long or occupies too much space. We don't live in a world of oceans, according to such judgment, but rather a tiny little thimble in which ideas should fit neatly, precisely, and concisely. The frugal effect. To be very frugal is interesting because the word very, the adjectival modifier, isn't really necessary. And if one were going to be truly frugal, one would have left it out and simply said he was frugal. But the consideration of such adjectival modifiers in the construction of frugality and its economics of measure and the availability of resources to the world doesn't belong to the considerations of the sentence, he was very frugal. In all of these ways, I am dissimilar to the idea of the frugality of Marcel Duchamp. 6. He was measured. In what sense was he measured? In what sense does the sentence, he was measured, measure out its meanings? There are so many measurements of meaning which can be inferred from the sentence, he was measured. Does he was measured have an idiomatic significance which exceeds my understanding? Perhaps. Was he was measured mean, could he was measured mean he was tailored? Could it mean the same thing as he was very frugal? Measured meaning patterned, measured meaning limited, measured meaning what you could place in a thimble. Suppose you wanted to place your frugality inside a thimble because the world is not an ocean and doesn't have time or space for speaking about a lot of different types of things. And so you'd have to measure out your frugality very carefully to fit it inside a thimble. Measure could also be the measurement of a measured line. Let's try it. He was very frugal. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 syllables. He was measured. 1, 2, 3, 4 syllables. In this sense, he was measured is a measurement much more frugal than he was very frugal. By being measured as meter or syllabic measure, if we wanted to call it syllabic measure, is there really any meter in he was very frugal? He was measured. He was measured approaches an iamb, certainly more iambic than he was very frugal. And being more iambic than he was very frugal is perhaps another way of being measured. He was measured as I am measuring Marcel Duchamp. So in the first sense of he was measured, well, there are more than two, but in the first sense as being tailored, I've never been tailored. So in this way, I'm very unlike Marcel Duchamp. In the second sense of measuring out into a thimble full of meaning what can be measured, I am also very unlike Marcel Duchamp. But in that fourth sense of counting meter, even though I'm very bad at it and bad at recognizing pseudo-subtle forms of meter and measure inside rhythm lines and patterns, I can do it if pressed. And I was pretty good at measuring the number of syllables in he was very frugal and comparing that to the number of syllables in he was measured. And in assigning a greater value to the line he was measured than to the line he was very frugal. Additionally, he was measured, lacking, at least for me, the idiomatic stability of, the literalist line, he was very frugal, opens itself up to possibilities of semiotic ambiguity, which is, again, from my perspective, poetically more interesting, and more interesting as a communicative act because of the polysemy and possibilities of interpretation. And in that sense, being measuring the number of possibilities within the utterance or sentence, if one prefers to literalize it as it exists here on a page, articulated by a series of letters rather than sounds made in the mouth. In that sense, too, as a measure of the openness of meaning, I am perhaps more like Marcel Duchamp than in the other ways that one might be measured as being like or unlike Marcel Duchamp. 7. He was always in control. 8. He never Perhaps it's possible to make generalizations based on a limited number of individual experiences. Perhaps it's possible to abstract from one's own experience the experience of a general public to allude to a universality. He never interrupted me. He never interrupted her. He never interrupted I. He never interrupted they. He never interrupted him. He never interrupted she. He never interrupted before. He never interrupted after. He never interrupted within. Perhaps it's possible. He never, excuse me? What? He never, in these ways, I'm very unlike Marcel Duchamp. 9. He never raised his voice. 10. He was un bourgeois d'une haute couture. Well, I'm not French. Il avait des manières absolument exquisites. Well, I'm not French. Having lost count, I am also very unlike Marcel Duchamp, who, it is said, was measured. In order to gain or regain count, I'll perform a counting of the ways in which we have articulated my unlikeness to Marcel Duchamp thus far. 1. He was warm. 2. He was very careful with his language. 3. He was magical. 4. He was not judgmental. 5. He was very frugal. 6. He was measured. At 6, I should perhaps pause and note that I may have miscounted or misremembered or misidentified where I was in any of these articulations of my differences from Marcel Duchamp, because unlike Marcel Duchamp, I have a counting disability called dyscalculia. And being a measured individual, I seriously doubt that Marcel Duchamp was possessed with this particular genius of disability. Having said this, I have once again lost count and will begin from the beginning. 1. He was warm. 2. He was very careful with his language. 3. He was magical. 4. He was not judgmental. 5. He was very frugal. 6. He was measured. 7. He was always in control. 8. He never interrupted. 9. He never raised his voice. 10. He was un bourgeois de haute couture. 11. Il avait des manières absolument exquises. 12. He was a very kind person. I too consider myself a very kind person. However, I am not positive, in fact, I doubt very much, that I would be identified as a very kind person by, at least if one could, generalize, right, an abstract, normative judge of very kind people. And if I were to be paraded in front of this judge, or perhaps row of judges, judging the kindness of people, I'm not entirely certain that I would be sorted into the very kind, as opposed to the ordinarily kind or the minimally kind. However, if the judgment of a very kind person could be interpreted as a judgment of a very kind human, close to certain that my dogs, many of whom I've saved from destruction, would agree with the statement and would argue, I am indeed a very kind person. In this way, depending on who is doing the judging and how the judgmentalism is performed, and whether it is performed, frugally and measured by human experience, and those humans who are always in control, in an uninterrupted environment without raising voices, but still harnessing the apparatuses of power, or whether made abstractly and imaginatively from the subjective point of view of an animal, I am either very much like Marcel Duchamp in this respect, or perhaps somewhat unlike him. 13, I believe, not certain, having lost count, of the number, he had time for everything and everybody. This particular statement, being an obvious falsification, and misrepresentation of the truth, doesn't particularly command our interest or possess the value required for us to make a comparison so we can strike through it. He was extremely tempted to repeat for this particular sentence what I stated for sentence number 13. I'm not sure of the count, but something else is going on here as well. Extremely discreet, because perhaps discretion was a style. Perhaps discretion in Duchamp is a style of playing with word, with language, with the alteration of sign to hide and to keep secret. Because the word secret is part of discreet. And if in discreet we want to discuss secrecy, because secrecy is either required or a playful apparatus of meaning that belongs to the complexity with which our communications are made and our artistry is performed, then by means of indiscretion, I am perhaps somewhat like Marcel Duchamp in terms of the extremity with which his practice of the discrete. 15, perhaps, I've lost count. Let's go back. 1, he was warm. 2, he was very careful with his language. 3, he was magical. 4, he was not judgmental. 5, he was very frugal. 6, he was measured. 7, he was always in control. 8, he never interrupted. 9, he never raised his voice. 10, he was un bourgeois d'une haute couture. What was that again? Let's go back. He was warm. 1. 2, he was very careful with his language. 3, he was magical. 4, he was not judgmental. 5, he was very frugal. 6, he was measured. 7, he was always in control. 8, he never interrupted. 9, he never raised his voice. 10, let's try to remember 10 this time. He was un bourgeois de haute couture. 11, il avait des manières absolument exquis. 12, he was a very kind person. 13, he had time for everything and everybody. 14, he was extremely discreet. 15, he had a thing about waterfalls. Is that the number that we miscounted? He had a thing about waterfalls. Okay, let's say we're here. Now I've lost track of where we are. It's a little bit like taking the SAT test for me and filling in the wrong bubbles, which one doesn't do, if presumably one is measured, as Marcel Duchamp was, and very frugal, and doesn't have a kind of disability, which is a continuum of dyscalculia, dysgraphia, and dyslexia. I believe that he had a thing about waterfalls is still number 15, and if I were filling in a little bubble on the SAT form, I would check the bubble that says, no, I don't have a thing about waterfalls. 16. He wasn't the kind of man you ran up and hugged. 16. I don't know what the kind of man you ran up to, I suppose. Is there a missing preposition? Missing word here? Ran up. You don't run up a man, right? Okay. He wasn't the kind of man you ran up. Ran up to, right? Requires a preposition, doesn't it? Isn't there a preposition meaning missing here? Because if you ran up the man, what would that mean? You can ring up a man, which is different, right? If you're at the cash register or he's purchasing something. But running up him, well, for me to run up a man, he would have to be an awfully big man. And if he were that big, hugging him would be merely symbolic because you couldn't get your arms around him. Let's just suppose that there's a 2 there, and then I think I've already answered the question. 17? Is this 17? Waterfalls, I believe, I remember being 16. So if we add, plus 1 to 16, I believe he wasn't the kind of man you ran up to or put a 6 there and hugged. That this would be 17, and then the next number would be 18, correct? 16 plus 2. So he never talked about 16 plus 2. He never talked about art. Well, I seem to be talking about it right now. So that's another way in which I'm apparently not like Marcel Duchamp. He was simple. So 16 plus 3 is 19. But if we use, if 6 was 9, then this would have been, actually, if we did that, we'd have to start, from the beginning again and reevaluate 6 and 9. But utilizing if 6 was 9 in the method that we have of doing so, then this would actually be 19. And then 17 would go back to the regular count, and then 18 would go back to would stay on the regular count, and then 19 would become 16 once again. So 16 and or 19, he was simple. Yes, in this way, I am significantly like Marcel Duchamp.